Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. It is Thursday, January 12th, 2017, episode 22. Firstly, we wish you all a happy new year. For today's topic, we'll be joined by Strategicon co-host and SIA's resident existentialist philosopher, David Olney. Hello, David.
Hello, John. Happy Saturnalia, listeners.
You had to get that one in, didn't you?
I did.
Yes. Before we get started on today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategicon can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, as well as a link to our podcast on the Sage International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. In today's episode, the first for 2017, we'll ask the question, what are the key indicators for international relations in 2017? Are we seeing the end of the old post-World War II international order, and what is likely to replace it? With multiple challenges assaulting the established international system, a primarily US-based system, from climate change to cyberspace, from space and robotics to pandemics, refugees, terrorism and hybridized warfare, to accommodating the ongoing shift from an Atlantic-based to a Pacific-based commercial and political order, can the structures we have built over the past 70 years cope? Are they liable to adapt, or will they collapse under the strain of their own set of internal contradictions? But before we attack these substantive questions, the first question I have for David is, what are your top 5 issues that you see will affect the world in 2017?
Once again, we start with the big question. Okay, I'm going to start with one that affects perception, and that is, it appears we are in an era where truth is dead. The fact that so much of the campaign in America last year, the presidential campaign, was about the idea of truthiness. It doesn't matter if things are true, it matters if they feel true. It seems that so many of the rational gains of the Enlightenment in the 20th century in particular are now being given up for fear and malice and difference, and that will colour any of the other 4 I think of after this point.
You did mention the idea that perhaps we were never really in a truthful state. What makes you think that today is fundamentally different from any other day in modern history, when governments deliberately lie and manipulate information to deceive the people? What is the difference that we're seeing today that we haven't already seen in the past?
I think it's a combination of the pace of activity and the unfamiliarity of activity. We're at the point now where, okay, climate skeptics out there, put your fingers in your ears now. We're at the point now where predicting weather is difficult because it's not the same as it was 10 years ago. You can't compare this year to 10 years ago to 20 years ago. We've now got an uncertainty principle in so many aspects of life that if you put that uncertainty together with pace, that everything is so immediate, that everyone wants you to reply to the phone call or the email or the text now, that there's no time to think, no time to qualify, and nothing clear to compare it against. We tried objective reality, and where there was some consistency with pace, it was valuable. But if we don't have some type of cohesive morality, and things aren't the same, neither do we have an objective reality based on science or analysis, we now have uncertainty plus pressure. And in that world, Rational thought takes too long. Unconscious limbic system reactions, how do I feel about this, seems to be becoming so important. And how we feel about things is not going to lead to good quality answers.
So what role does the media play in all of this? I mean, ultimately they are the fourth estate. They are meant to be the people's voice, for the masses out there who can't get their hands dirty and don't have the time to sit down and analyze things. The media has played the government's hand, hasn't it? I mean, it's spouting policy, it's being able to be manipulated by government to tell the government's message to the people, whether the people want to listen to it or not. Has the media also failed in its fundamental role as arbiters of the truth?
I would say absolutely, and I'll use a practical example. 3 days before Christmas, getting a phone call at 1 p.m. from a news channel to talk about security in the centre of Adelaide and Adelaide Oval, to film the story 90 minutes later, to go on the news that night knowing that the journalist in question was going to do another story between filming mine and going back to edit the two for the 6 o'clock news. They are in the same cycle of it's so fast, there's no time to do proper analysis, so they run on, what do I feel about it? What does the audience feel about it? And I will give the journalist in question credit that in a very limited time he tried to do something that was more objective reality than truthiness. And I give him credit for being the odd man out. But he was the odd man out.
Okay, so truthiness is your number one. What is your number two for 2017?
After truthiness, I think we have to get to the fact that the idea of meaningful compromise seems to be deteriorating so significantly. It's almost like now, if the United Nations work on something, it's a 3-year compromise to the point where the end point is pointless. But that beyond that, any kind of meaningful compromise, accepting the idea of majority rule with minority consent, accepting that you might be in the winning position, but everyone else's opinion matters. We seem to be at the point where under pressure, us versus them, in-group, out-group, is the logical extension of truthiness. And that we will get to the point where the minority who are trying to do objective analysis will be seen by the truthy majority as, you lot just cause problems. So I would argue that we have two massive problems before any tangible, definable issues of how we're seeing, perceiving and functioning in the world.
Okay, so if that's the case, then what does that say about political opposition in democracies? We put a lot of faith in the idea that even if we don't like the government we're saddled with, we still have an opposition. But from my observations, the opposition is no opposition at all. It essentially repeats government policy, it accepts government policy, and only in very minor degrees does it actually separate itself and creates an alternate space. How does this work in your opinion, in terms of, do we have vibrant political oppositions in democracies today?
A good opposition puts forward ideas for us to mull over and to decide, is that valuable enough that we want to give them a chance to spend 3, 4, 5, however many years trying to implement that idea that they've thought about and we've thought about. In this era of too little time plus truthiness, how can an opposition be anything other than a mirror of the mediocrity that is governments that in the first place are doing truthiness and too little time? It seems to me that if there's an opposition party out there somewhere doing good policy that's deeply thought out with a long-term strategy to apply it, it certainly doesn't seem to be in any of the major Western democracies that appear in our news cycle.
So you're number 3 then, David?
Oh golly, number 3. A conglomerate. We've seen the consequence of a decline in manufacturing in most Western nations, and moving that manufacturing to China mean that we can all have cheap stuff. But now we're seeing the consequence of putting all that manufacturing using coal as the main fuel source in one country. And that is a combination of economic destabilisation and environmental disaster. So I'll just call number 3 China.
Okay. Wisely said. Number 4.
Ooh, number 4, Russia, because they wish they had as much money as China.
And final pick?
The Middle East, because if anyone could ever work it out, it would mean we were living in cloud cuckoo land.
Well, that doesn't seem too dissimilar from what I would put forward. I mean, I suppose my number 1 would be Trump China and Trump Russia. Trump China, obviously because Donald Trump, in his infinite wisdom, has decided to break with the mantra of a one China policy, and has, at least in his sort of preamble to the presidency, reached out to the Taiwanese president, which then of course certainly offended the Chinese government that likes the idea of considering Taiwan as a rogue Chinese province but not an independent state. I think Trump Russia, because I have no conception that what we're seeing in terms of this bromance between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin is going to last. I think that given sufficient time and space, the two world leaders will diverge, and as they diverge, then we're going to be in a really seriously bad place, I think, internationally. My number 2 would be Venezuela. I think the sleeping issue internationally is the fact that we have a country that, for all intents and purposes, should have been one of the richest countries in Latin America or in South America. And yet, by dint of corruption by the government, by dint of absolute and abject mismanagement, we're seeing one of the potentially most wealthiest countries turn into an absolute black hole, essentially. And if Venezuela then does become South America's first country to have a mass famine, I think that that's going to have extraordinary knock-on effects in the Western Hemisphere. I do think that you will end up seeing uncontrolled people movement from Venezuela moving north toward the United States to escape famine and possible revolution and civil war. I think the cyber domain will be picked as my number 4. The cyber domain is something that we have been seeing evolve over the last few years into an enormous weapon of mass distraction. If anyone believed, for instance, that the Russians or Russian hackers had a key role in what happened in the United States in the election of Donald Trump, then we can see that we're seeing the maturity of cyberspace as a domain for interstate conflict at another level entirely. Then my last one would be the fall of the EU. I think that 2017 will see the end of the European Union as we understand it. I think that there's a likelihood that there will be a rump European Union, something much smaller, perhaps in some sort of ethno-linguistic contrivance that'll be more congenial to having stuff done. But the current makeup of the European Union will certainly not see 2017 out. So the idealism behind the EU, which was always a technocratic contrivance, I think will fail this year. And I think that Italy will probably be the Achilles heel of the failure of the European Union. That's my pick.
That's a good set of picks, and I think it brings up some fascinating things, because Venezuela then brings in so many of the other things we're interested in. How will it be spun? How will it be debated? Is it an opportunity for China to guarantee energy? Is it an opportunity for Russia to further destabilise another oil producer?
Yeah.
In the same way that they've probably tried to use Syria to destabilise the Middle East to guarantee the value of their natural resources in a world where they're under sanctions. Could the South Americans act cohesively as a consequence and come more together, which they're trying to do? Would the United States tolerate them doing this? Yeah. Venezuela's fascinating in that it brings almost everything else we've talked about into play.
So, if that's the case, then looking at the international order as it's currently structured, is the alphabet soup of multilateral and bilateral agreements enough to solve the complex political, environmental, and social problems that we see today?
I suppose we'll go back to something you said in the introduction to make sense of this, and that is the old Europe falling to bits, the post-World War II Europe? Now, post-World War II world, Europe in particular, was based on two ideologies doing a fight to the death. We hadn't hit peak oil, we hadn't hit peak most things. So there was strong ideology and spare stuff. That was an aberration in human history. So I would argue that, if anything, we're returning to a pre-World War II world model, and that is constant tension. Constant machinations for alliance, constant instability, constant eyeballing of each other to see who's going to blink first or who's going to act first. And that this seems distressing at the moment because we had, from 1945 to 1991, an artificial period of bipolarity instead of genuine multilateralism. Multiple players, multiple different interests, multiple different levels of economic development, political machination. We're returning to normal, but we're returning to normal in a world where energy is more expensive, rare earth minerals are harder to get, fertilizer is harder to get, debt is more expensive, trade is less easily governed within pre-existing regional or imperial entities. So it's like going back to the late 19th, early 20th century, but with an additional pressure on access to resources.
From what you've just said, it doesn't seem that the old system can reform itself. Does it need to be extinguished to make room for political, economic, and social rebirth?
It seems to me that in an era where compromise is either 3 years and pointless or impossible, it's almost inevitable that things have to break. Because reform just doesn't seem to be on the agenda for most people. You know, we've now got a new head of the UN who seems the ultimate mellow, let's talk about it, let's come up with a compromise. That's lovely in a period where things are slow and reliable. But how can it possibly be applied in a period where everything is rarer and the powder keg is bigger?
And the fact that governments generally move at very rapid pace in spite of the fact that governments generally can't keep up with the pace that they're setting.
Yeah, so they're scrambling.
Yeah.
They're acting faster than they should, but slower than is needed. So it's a terrible combination of faster than you need to get it right, but too slow to genuinely change the outcome.
So if the system can't hold as we understand the system to be, what are the alternatives? More globalization or less? More national sovereignty or less? Can a balance be struck between these competing forms of power?
I'll go back to one of my favourite people for answering these questions. I'll go back to Ian Bremmer, because I still think Ian Bremmer has answered these questions in a more robust way than anyone else. That it's going to come down to, what does your state have to offer other states? And if you have something valuable to offer, you will become a pivot state, but you will only be as valuable as the last deal you could offer people. So the idea of old long-term loyalties, you can't imagine them lasting in this more competitive world. And that if you've got something good to offer, new people might be willing to make deals.
Just as a bit of a flippant point here, could you say that Donald Trump came out of Bremer's rulebook? Because he is the transactional president. He will not know any loyalty other than what America can get at the moment. If Bremer is right, then Donald Trump is the archetypal president of the new era.
I wonder if we took a very anthropological line, if we could argue that Trump will be the kind of leader that will help break the old system, start the new system. But the key thing with Bremer's model is he says this transactional period won't be that long. That people who work together for a while will realise we're starting to build trust, we're starting to understand each other. You get to that point of developing, what's the wonderful description anthropologists used? an intersubjective reality. And it's an observation from sociologists, psychs, and anthropologists. Small groups of people are very egalitarian. Otherwise, groups splinter. Once you get above a certain size, you can't all know the rules or bring about equality in a personal way. So you come up with a set of very well-defined rules that exist in that overarching way that Benedict Anderson put forward in Imagined Communities. So Bremer's not saying that pivot states and the states around them exist in a transactional era for long. He's saying that's what breaks the old system, creates this combination of regional bodies or affinity bodies. But then as they realise they've got affinity, they're looking after each other, you get genuine bonds of affinity. Even if we don't have shared culture, we've learnt to appreciate the way each other behave. That there is a degree of reciprocity that makes long-term alliances possible. And I would argue that this is why Trump has to be viewed as a transitionary figure, because he can break the old. But who can imagine Trump being capable of diplomatic reciprocity?
Well, I certainly can't.
No, it just doesn't seem likely. He's made money in an industry where someone owns real estate.
Yeah.
It's either me or you, or one of us doesn't own it.
Mm.
There's no capacity, it seems, in that world for reciprocity. To end up multiple billions of dollars in debt running casinos, which is just greed is good, it doesn't seem that is a world of reciprocity. So it's the ultimate extension of quote-unquote American rugged individualism, which could really also be labelled as, loony greed.
It could also be labelled as something a little bit more darker, considering the fact that business being conducted in the construction industry in the United States, which may have some form of shady dealing with the underworld, or that violence is a part of the transactional deed. And if this is something that the Trump administration will bring to the table, surely we're looking at a more violent time.
It would seem to me that whether it was Trump or not, the race issues in America, the poverty versus affluence issues, the coastal versus, flatlands in the middle issues, the Midwest, the Rust Belt, must look in either direction and go, that's not my country. That the different reasons for division, the polarization of in and out groups is not just at national levels. Some nations can clearly have internal cohesion. It seems the United States is one that is highly unlikely. Listeners, before we started recording this today, we were just sitting and watching and listening to Obama's speech today. And it came across as a delusional final statement for an irrelevant Democratic Party pretending they'd been fabulous. And an 8-year president who, excluding reforms to the medical system, can't really point to anything that worked. And even his one victory, if you believe in the benefit of healthy citizens can then lead more productive lives, is probably going to be undone by the Republicans in the next few weeks. How could the Americans hold together when a president's final speech is a delusion of truthiness that cannot stand up to historical analysis?
Yeah, that's a very good point, David. And yet, it also leads us back to the elephant in the room. In the short to medium term, China will not be able to easily integrate within the existing US-led international system. It is an autocracy, and its commercial economic model appears rapacious and insatiable. Do you think that while good for the Chinese Politburo because it weds the Chinese elite to the concept of growth, and with Chinese people generally driven by profit, the people on the street are less likely to turn against the system, does this attitude of absolute control make China unfit for international leadership? After all, it has been unable to forge a system of formalized alliances in Asia due to the fact that many Asian states distrust Chinese motives.
I guess China is trying to provide a kind of certainty for its people. And yet historically, because when there are upheavals in China, they are so big. People talk about how entrepreneurial the Chinese are. Is that a natural state, or is it a consequence of the fact that when there are upheavals, they're so big, and that if you don't look after yourself, no one else will? So I think reading too strong a link between the Politburo and the people is always dangerous in China. because the Chinese people have thousands of years' experience of things go from very good to very bad very quickly, and that you are responsible for saving yourself and those immediately around you. So it seems to me the Chinese people have an incredible capacity for making the best out of instability. But their new instability is also that their environment is becoming unlivable.
China has always historically dominated Asia because it has always been the largest state entity in that region. However, because of China's position as workshop of the world, does that by itself allow China to be considered the automatic successor to the United States internationally? And can it be, because it is an autocracy, it is not a democracy? Its soft power reaches some places, but not all places. If you look at the United States, for instance, its soft power permeates pretty much everything. I mean, from the entertainment industry to politics to society to trying to live a better life. You know, the American dream has become the globalized dream. Where is the Chinese alternative? If China wants to dethrone the United States, if it wants to be the number one power, where is the Chinese version of the American system that we can all buy into?
I guess it comes back to what we were talking about can the post-World War II system survive? The Americans offered certainty for everyone who was on the Liberal Democratic side in the Cold War. And they had enough money to be able to prop up economies and run proxy wars and keep everything ticking along. So as much as soft power was incredibly important in the Cold War and even in the 90s, I think really since 9/11, the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, soft power looks pretty cheesy. And we see more things fraying each year, which suggests that actually, if you can't offer certainty, soft power buys you money while things are still good. The Chinese have bought their way into influence and control. But as Africa kind of shows, they spend a bag of money and the next day someone puts a hand out and says, it's a new day. Pay me off again. Yep. Something's changed. There's a new variable. You are not offering me certainty. You are not offering me anything I couldn't get a different way. And if you are a country that can make stuff but doesn't have energy, doesn't have the raw materials to make stuff, what certainty precisely can you offer anyone else? As we've seen in becoming the workshop of the world, that was a decision that an authoritarian state could make. But it's nothing particularly unique to China. Someone else could do it if they had the guts, and we'd ship the oil and the raw materials somewhere else.
Okay, well, let's have a look at that other potential player, India. I mean, its international leadership aspirations are arguably tainted by internal chaos and driven by an Indian-specific logic which is not easily translated into a non-Indian context. So in that case, if China is not necessarily the automatic successor of the United States as being the next hyperpower, and the West is looking to India as being, well, the one just under China and perhaps the only competitor that can actually take it to Chinese power, can it?
They exist in instability better than anyone. Having a pantheon of gods, having genuine multiculturalism, accepting the inconsistencies of life is the norm. And in a world without certainty, a model that is able to ebb and flow with uncertainty is never going to run the joint. But it's not a bad model for not getting seasick.
Is that then something that we ought to be hitching our wagon to, though? If the West is in terminal decline, if we're looking at the Atlantic-based civilizational model failing, or at least not being able to resuscitate itself at any level, is then India the better wagon to hitch our star to, as opposed to China?
if we took the pivot state model from Bremer again, there's no reason why India can't both be a pivot state for smaller countries, but also in partnership with multiple countries who want to build decent relationships. The French-Indian military links are big. The Australian-Indian political links are growing. The American-Indian political links are growing. The social links between America and India, Australia and India, are surprisingly big when you look at the proportion of very educated Indians living in both countries. India perhaps fits this new world model of it's not big enough and crazy enough to be frightening. You can work with it in a way that we don't see in a lot of other places. That if we're talking about a world where you make deals with people where there's an advantage, where you don't feel intimidated, where it's fluid, India seems a much better partner in this fluid world than China.
Do you think that we'll ever be able to see a time where China and India, irrespective of the issues stated, can contribute to international changes in a similar way that we understand North America and Europe have done?
No, because the era of clearly defined ideology, excess economic production being used to fund an artificial stability, I think is over. So we either have a Chinese model that is authoritarian and tries to change direction as a monolith, or the fluid adaptability of India. And as much as the Chinese monolith has done well at becoming the workshop of the world, things are only going to get more complicated and more difficult. And anyone whose innate state is fluidity, I think, has an advantage that can't be underestimated.
Thanks for listening to this episode. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We're always looking to pass on the most interesting information on international relations and security to our social media followers. And until next time, it's goodbye from me, John Bruni.
And goodbye from me, David Olney.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.